Excellent. And can you hear me well? Fantastic. So welcome everyone. Thanks for joining a second virtual workshop on national extension services and definancing, brought to you by the fabulous Green Commodities community. A particular thanks for the people joining us in the early morning or late evening. We have normally representatives today from Indonesia. We're supposed to have Ivory Coast, Liberia, Papua New Guinea, Costa Rica, as well as colleagues from the global team. A few people are not there yet. Most of you have participated in the first virtual workshop that we organized in June, or viewed the recording afterwards. And for those of you who did not, my name is Nicolas Petit. I work for the UNDP Green Commodities program as a senior commodities advisor, and I'm based in Hong Kong. And so basically in this workshop today, we're going to take a deeper dive into the different concepts on extension that we introduced last time. And let me see, changing slides. So just as a reminder, the question we are trying to answer together in this thematic stream on extension is the following, is how do we strengthen national extension advisory systems in the particular context of multi-stakeholder processes and sustainable production? So that's a bit the topic of the day and of the workshop. So today we are going to have 19 minutes together maximum, and I'm going to try to be strict on time. We're going to start with a presentation from Christine Davis on the best fit framework and country application examples. We're going to have then space to ask questions about the presentation. And then I'm going to present in more detail the UNDP Green Commodities Program Toolkit on extension that we are developing. And I'm going to also explain the relevance of that toolkit for specific GCP countries with people participating in the call. So I'm going to present specifically Indonesia, Liberia, and Papua New Guinea. And then we're going to have breakout discussion and then reports from the group in plenary. And then I'm going to explain as well the next steps. So, sorry. So we're going to have, so Christine, do you want to present a new computer, or you want me to put the slides?
I can share my screen.
Okay, so let me just introduce you. So first, thanks a million for being here today with us. Christine is a senior research fellow in the Development Strategy and Governance Division of the International Food Policy Research Institute. She's based in Pretoria, and she has basically conducted research on a number of topics of direct relevance to us on farm and field schools, agricultural innovation systems, pluralistic extension systems, and extension education in Africa and worldwide. She has some 40 peer-reviewed journal articles, book chapters, and policy brief. And publications include The New Face of Agricultural Extension Services, as well as Extension in Sub-Saharan Africa, Overview and Assessment of Past and Current Models. So we're very happy to have you today. I think you are the right person to give us a general overview of what IFPRI has developed called the Best Fit framework. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and you can put your presentation.
Okay, now let's find share and the Best Fit framework. Great, so good day to everyone, whatever time of day it is for you. As Nicolo mentioned, we want to go a deeper dive into the Best Fit framework, and I give you some background on the framework from the IFPRI perspective. I think a group of researchers put together these ideas on the best fit framework almost 10 years ago. But what we want to discuss today is, what do we mean by the best fit? What are some elements of the framework? What are some implications for sustainable production, which you guys are focusing on? And then we're going to look at 2 country examples to see how it's applied in real life. I think Nicola presented the framework in June. I looked at the webinar that you guys had, and he did it very well, as well as defining extension, talking about how extension has evolved over the decades, and also the context in which extension operates today, the idea of the agricultural innovation systems, many sources of knowledge and innovation, the different actors in the system, which is now very pluralistic in terms of extension. There's multiple sources of knowledge, the interactions between these actors, and also just the holistic approaches to extension and approaches that go beyond production. Today, extension is much more participatory. There's focus on many things like markets and gender, climate change. So as it says in the toolkit that's been drafted, there's really no blueprints to strengthen extension. We need to have locally tailored solutions. So I wanted to show you first the big picture. I know it's a lot of detail, but we'll go column by column and tease out some of the key elements. Basically, what I want to show you here is an impact chain approach. So we're focusing here on the green, the extension service characteristics, the governance structure, capacity management, and advisory methods. What we're saying with the fit is that your extension service is going to very much depend on the contextual factors, the policy environment, capacity, production system, community aspects, and so forth. So that's where the fit comes in. And then when we go back to the green, the second column, how these services are organized and managed and the methods that are used is going to in turn affect the performance of the system, which then affects households, decision-making, adoption and knowledge change and so forth, and leads ultimately to impact. So that's basically what the best fit framework is showing. I'm going to break out these columns and go one by one to tease out the elements a bit more. The contextual factors are the big factors external to extension that do affect how our extension services are designed. The policy environment is how your country is governed. Is it centralized or decentralized? What's the political system and the policies, strategies, and methods that are affecting how we provide extension services? If we're thinking of sustainability, we think about whether there's specific policies on sustainability on their own or within agriculture or extension. The capacity is then the ability of the service providers to provide the services. Are they capable to advise on sustainable production, or do they just know about very basic things of production that aren't related to sustainability? And then our production systems, you know, are the crops, the products that are being grown, the farming systems, input and output markets. Do we have things like integrated pest management, intercropping, soil fertility management? These are the kinds of things we might think about with sustainable production. And then finally, the community aspects. So these are your farmers, producers of different kinds. What size of land do they have? Gender, who's involved in agriculture? Men, women, youth. What is their education level? What's the level of social capital? Are the farmers in groups or not really? So these are all things that are going to affect how you're going to provide your extension services. Then we go to that area that I showed you in green. This is the extension service characteristics. So we have the governance structures. I think Nicola presented the last time the table or the matrix of who provides and who funds extension services. Sometimes the government funds and the private sector provides, or NGOs fund and the public provides. There's many different models of how that can work. And also in governance structures, we need to think about linkages. How are there mechanisms to coordinate between the pluralistic actors, and how do the extension services link to research or education or others. Then again, we have the capacity of the providers, and this is more focused on number of staff, their training, the infrastructure. Do they have an office? Do they have internet? Do they have transportation? These kinds of things. And very, very important here with today's changing world is the continuing education for extension agents, or topping up of skills to continue to keep them up to speed with what's going on in agriculture globally. The management then is a third characteristics. This is how your extension services themselves are managed and run in terms of managing the human resources. Important here are things like incentive systems. Do we have a career path for extension agents? Are there rewards? Are the salaries adequate to motivate people to be an extension, and so forth? And then lastly, what most people think of with extension are the methods, how extension interacts with farmers and communicates and educates or empowers farmers. So we want to think about here the audience that you're trying to reach. Are you trying to reach many people or few? Are your audience literate or illiterate? Are we trying to reach women or men? Is there a customer focus or a clientele focus in our methods? So again, here training is very important for the extension agents. And we have things like information and communication technologies, or ICTs. They can help us to increase our reach, but there's also some pitfalls there as well. We also mentioned farmer field schools, which is an important type of method for sustainable production. And many times the topics are a bit complicated to teach. And so we need to go in an intensive type of method like farmer field schools. And then we move on from the characteristics to the performance of the extension system, the outcomes, and the impact. So if we look at the quality of services, this includes things like the content. Is it relevant? Does it address issues of sustainability? Is the service timely? Is it effective and efficient? Is it responsive and demand-driven to the needs of farmers, and so forth? And then the changes in behavior that I talked about, these are the outcome level changes, things like attitude, knowledge, adoption. And then that leads finally to impacts. Often you cannot attribute impacts directly to an extension program. That's a really tricky thing, but we can, talk about contributions that extension can make to yields, productivity, income, empowerment, environmental outcomes, and so forth. So that's the impact chain approach of the best fit framework. What I wanted to do now was to look at two cases, first of all, Liberia and then Rwanda, in terms of applying that best fit framework to look at these two countries and sort of analyze and diagnose the extension system that way. So the first is Liberia. We conducted basically a desk review in 2017. And I think, as was mentioned in June, this is part of a USAID project. It's a Feed the Future country under the project that I lead, which is called Developing Local Extension Capacity. Basically, we wanted to inform on the status of extension to investors and funders in Liberian extension systems and make recommendations to improve their extension system. So when we take a look at Liberia, let's think about first those contextual things. And important for the context of Liberia extension systems are three big events: the Civil War, the election of Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, and then also the Ebola virus. This affects the whole country, and in specific, it affects extension services as well. So I'm going to take a look at Liberia extension system using those framework elements: the policy, environment, governance, financing, capacity, methods, etc. So the extension policy, there exists an extension policy, which is good. Many countries don't have them. It was developed in 2012 as part of a broader comprehensive agricultural development plan that the country has. Obviously, agriculture is very important, but this policy provides sort of the legal framework for what they hope is going to be a pluralistic, decentralized, demand-driven, and market-oriented system. So your policy helps drive the extension services to meet these kinds of goals that many extension services have. In terms of governance, Ministry of Agriculture is basically the authority for extension on the public side. It is a pluralistic system, but we do have the issue then of coordination. So we have the ministry, we have local and international NGOs, there's private sector as well, providing extension services. And so part of our recommendations were about the need for public-private partnerships and also for better coordination. In terms of financing, so the entire Ministry of Agriculture budget is about 8.4 million a year, and the extension services are just half a million, so about 6% of the total for that, which is really insufficient for program delivery and effective services. The donor projects tend to be better financed, but of course then they are time bound and so forth. The private sector, of course, does charge for services, so they're more financially sustainable. Okay, so those are the first elements of the framework. There's just a few more: the capacity, the management, and the methods. So we found a ratio of extension agent to farmer between 1 in 1,000 to 1 to 5,000. So you want to be obviously on the lower end. I think recommendations from FAO are more like 1 to 500 or 1 to 800, depending on your farming system. So it's a rather high ratio. This is the public service. We didn't have the data for the other services. In terms of capacity provision, basically in-service training is very ad hoc. I think it mainly depends on projects that are going on. Then if a public extension service is involved in a project, they get some training. We also found that the technical side of the training was much stronger than those functional skills that extension agents need. So you need, as an extension agent, you need to know technical things like animal production or crops, natural resource management, but you also need to know things like communication, group development, and then broader things like market linkages, value chain approaches, use of ICTs, and so forth. So obviously, they need to have more training on the functional side as well. In terms of management of the public system, we did find that they have a staff performance system, which works more or less relatively well. So there is that in place, which is better than a lot of other countries that we did look at. And then finally, for Liberia, the methods that are used, mostly group approaches, often face-to-face. They do use lead farmers, the farmer field school approaches, demonstrations, workshops, and fairs. But there is high illiteracy in Liberia, so that often precludes print media. We recommend the use of further ICTs to reach more farmers, but of course, ones that are relevant for people who maybe can't read or write. So that's Liberia, really quickly. We'll have time for some questions at the end of my presentation, actually. Let's move to case 2, which was Rwanda. So we wanted to sort of give an example of what we might call a successful country, and I'll talk about why we call this a successful country in terms of the extension system. But once again, we conducted a desk review of Rwandan extension, looking at the status and recommending areas for investment. So as with many countries, agriculture is a key livelihood for Rwanda, but what makes it unique is that it's such a highly densely populated country, one of the highest in the world. And there's been a lot of agricultural economic growth since the genocide in 1994. Poverty, while high, it's really declining rapidly, and these are mostly a result of the agricultural policies by the government of Rwanda, as well as a lot of donor effort too. But looking again through the lens of the best fit framework, again, Rwanda has a national extension strategy, and they're really focused on improving production, increasing income, improving livelihoods, and they're really trying to reach all the farmers in the country, which really makes Rwanda unique in terms of the extension system. But back to the policy environment, they do have an ICT strategy as well, which is interesting, and that does have an effect on extension services as well. But in terms of governance, again, it's very focused on the public sector. They have a lot of control over extension provision. The Rwanda Agricultural Board is responsible, and it is a centralized system, but they run an extension program, let's say, called Twigiri Muhinzi, which was started in 2014. And this reaches all the way down to farmer groups, from the districts to sectors to cells to villages, and then the farmer groups. So this is their sort of national extension system. The private sector is limited as compared to other countries in the region, and there are a number of NGOs and, as I said, donors as well working in the space. With financing, obviously there's a significant government budget, but they are very donor reliant as well, so they heavily rely on donors. And then in terms of capacities of Rwandan extension, we have FFS, Farmer Field School Facilitators. The model Twigiri Muhinzi is really focused on the farmer field schools together with these demonstration plots that they have at farm level, together with farmer promoters, which are lead farmers who are working with extension, but they're locally based, part of the community there. And for the farmer field school facilitators, they do have the in-depth season-long training, and then these people are backstopping the farmer promoters as well. So the management, as I said, the farmer field school facilitators are backstopping the farmer promoters, but there's really no monitoring and evaluation. Actually, my project, DLEC, is now actually conducting an evaluation of one of the approaches to providing incentives to the farmer promoters. So we're going to see those results in the next year or so. But otherwise, they're not very good at monitoring and evaluation. As I mentioned, they today use farmer field schools. The old system in Rwanda was a top-down training and visit, sort of World Bank financed approach. But today they're using this model, twinning the farmer field schools together with the farmer promoters and then the Twigiri Muhinzi farmer groups. So it's all linked together and linked upwards and also horizontally at the farmer group level. We also see some examples of bundling of services. There is one big NGO called One Acre Fund in Rwanda. They've been there for 10 years. They have funding from Bill and Melinda Gates and Mercy Corps and some others. They're working with 164,000 farmers, and they have 1,800 staff, but they really work with lead farmers. And the difference with their lead farmers and the farmer promoters is that they actually get a kind of a salary. But they provide these bundled services where the farmers are receiving finance, plus seed and fertilizer, plus training, plus links to market. So that's one interesting example of bundling of services in Rwanda. But just to close out, why are we talking about Rwanda as, lessons from a successful system? Mostly it's because of the scaling and the sustainability. Rwanda has essentially reached almost every farmer in the country through the Twigiri Muhinzi model. So when they started, or they had a 32% coverage in 2012, 69% in 2015, and today it's almost the whole country. And as I said, the structure of Twigiri Muhinzi allows information flow both vertically and horizontally. It does empower farmers through the use of these groups, and it uses these community-based institutions in forms of the farmer groups. Also, using local people, the farmer promoters, this helps to enhance trust in the information and what the extension system is telling them. And then as with the rest of Rwandan culture, I think there's a very high female participation as well. So they're reaching both men and women farmers. Just some final thoughts, and then we'll move to Q&A and discussion as you like. But basically, this best fit framework that we're using allows analysis and also design of extension systems using that best fit approach based on the local context. But this means there's no easy answers. There's no cookie cutter approach that we can go and use like we did with training and visit, for instance. We have to fit every extension system to the local context, and this often goes below the national level too. So there's a lot of tweaking that has to be done and a lot of analysis. So I think the toolkit that is being developed is going to be really helpful in terms of analysis from that context. So I think from what I've seen of the toolkit, it's going to provide a lot of guidance on employing a best fit approach. And I think it's really important how I see it set up is that you're going to use existing platforms for the diagnosis of extension systems in the countries where you're working. So I think there was a mention of technical working groups. There's also a global organization called GFROS. It's the Global Forum for Rural Advisory Services. they have national level platforms in many of the countries where you're working, and that these platforms provide a place for people working in extension or interested in extension to come together and discuss, as well as the national commodity platform. So I think that's very important in terms of going forward and applying the best fit framework to this diagnosis. So with that, I'll turn it back to Nicola and maybe stop sharing my screen and we can have some questions and answers. Thanks.
Thank you so much for a very clear presentation. Can you hear me well?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So is there any questions from anyone? You can also type your question in the chat if you want. So who wants to get some clarification or more general question? Pascal.
Yeah, thank you very much, Christine. I think it was a very interesting presentation and I wasn't aware of this best fit framework. So great, thank you. I did notice though, I mean, the two case studies you brought forward are relatively small countries where handling extension services at the national level is easier, even with relatively modest budgets. I mean, if you take the case of Rwanda, especially, but if you take Indonesia, you know, then do you have examples of successful extension service provision, maybe in a blended fashion between the public and private sector in a large country like Indonesia, or recommendations?
Yeah, that's a bit. Thanks. Indonesia is a very large country. We haven't done, the closest country to that is Bangladesh, where we have a study as well. And then Nigeria, although Nigeria, I think the private sector is only now coming in, and there's very small pilot. There's many examples of small, maybe successful pilots of public-private engagement and working together. But yeah, not at a larger scale, not countrywide, not even statewide, I would say. One of the examples of countries, Mozambique is another country that we did, extremely pluralistic and a lot of coordination between public, NGO, and the private sector. So you might find some better examples in Mozambique. And then we have looked at some big countries, but I wouldn't, call Nigeria per se an example of a successful public-private partnership country.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else has a question? I have one for you while the others are thinking.
Pascal.
Okay, Pascal, go ahead.
Maybe he's muted.
Pascal, you're muted.
Muted 3 times at 3 level of my electronic device. So thanks, Christine. Very interesting. I have typically the question of the candid question of the person who is not a technical specialist, at least not in the field. I have, in my experience in previous life, I've seen a great deal of, I would call pseudo extensions services strategy being used for political favor to buy votes from a large majority of country population by the government in place. It's a very well disguised technique for populist politics. How can we organize ourselves to prevent this from happening, you think, in countries like PNG, where other countries where this practice are rampant?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Yeah, we can think of some examples of this. Ethiopia is a good one, Uganda as well, even Brazil.
Or even Rwanda, I think.
Yeah, definitely Rwanda. So the one thing that countries or extension experts try to do is to put a policy into law. So there's been some studies done across Africa to show how many countries have extension policies, but going one step beyond developing a document and actually putting it into law. So there's probably less than 5 countries in Africa that have it into law. So that's one step, so that every time the government changes, the policy doesn't get thrown out. It's still there because it's in law. So that's one way. The other way is to decouple the tasks of the extension agent from collecting credit, from distributing inputs, from actually going out and campaigning for the government. These are not appropriate extension tasks. But this has to be clearly, I think, stipulated within the management system that, extension agents are providing advice and training, but let's try to get the private sector to provide inputs and things like that. I see there's a question too from Ronald in the chat box. Shall I take that, or is there anyone else?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, he's asking, what are the approaches to linking successfully sustainable extension provision and rural development programs? The impact pathways, can you elaborate for successful performance? So I'm not sure about the second part of the question, but I think generally a country should first have an agricultural strategy, or as you say, rural development, and then the extension strategy, the extension policy or document should fit into that, and should be in line with the general country's strategies. And then of course you have policies and strategies at the organizational level too, not just the government ones, but donors and NGOs, the big NGOs, they also have their own policies and strategies. So I think there needs to be these mechanisms for coordination, for discussion of rural issues, like these, some countries have these donor working groups. That's one space for it. There's other countries that have sort of advisory panels for the extension services that bring in the farmers and the private sector and many others to comment on it. But I'm not sure about your question on the impact pathways. You're asking what constitutes successful performance?
You have to unmute yourself first, Ronald.
Ah, there. Oh, his speaker is not cooperating.
Okay, while he's unmuting,
Or you can chat.
I have
Go ahead.
Yeah, I
a question for you. Okay, Pascal, go ahead. Shoot.
I have a particular question.
Microphone, Pascal. No, bring it down, bring it down.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks. Matthias is there to really keep me focused. I have a question. I'm interested to see, you're mentioning several levels. In fact, for me, there is a national level where all the policy work and the mobilization of funding may take place in this. But a lot of our project worked at subnational level, provincial level, district level, landscape level. And I wonder whether what could be the link between these two, whether one comes first, followed by the second, whether you can start by a more subnational approach and then elevate it at the national level, or vice versa. What are the best practice in this? I'm also here speaking on behalf of colleagues from GIZ, who are very interested in this and couldn't join the call today, but will be listening to it.
Okay, yeah, no, that's another good question. There's a current debate going on within the international extension community about decentralization, because many countries have very intentionally decentralized so that services like extension are more demand driven, are closer to the farmer, are closer to the people that are being served. But we've seen in the example of Kenya, maybe Tanzania as well, that there's a lot of things that have to happen once you decentralize. So in Kenya example, now all the counties have their own strategies. I would agree with you to say that the national level should be sort of guiding and supporting and backstopping the counties or the provinces or the states or whatever. And there should be some sort of synergies between them, but what we're finding in practice is there's some sort of confusion and duplication, I think, when you have the decision, the devolution of power, of funding, of everything down to the subnational level, as you're talking about. So I can't mention any good practices per se. Maybe somebody else on the line has some, but certainly it's a reality now that many strategies and just extension services are at the subnational level. Like in Nigeria, for instance, you have to go to the state. I mean, you can go to the federal level, they're trying to do one thing, but at the states, one state has a lot of extension support and another state has almost nothing. So there is that reality to deal with when you're using programs. And then a lot of the programs are going to go to the states that, want these kinds of things. So it's going to be interesting. Nicola, shall I finish Ronald? He's trying to find out what might be a sort of path toward ensuring successful performance in the best fit framework, given that some interventions we are doing come at smaller levels. Yeah, I think the best fit framework is a lot about continuous tweaking as things evolve. So you might design your extension characteristics, the governance, the management, the methods, and then as you go down the line and see how is performance, what's the feedback from farmers, are there outcomes and impacts that we can see, you might need to start tweaking some things. So yeah, I think the path, and the best fit framework shows that there's these continuous feedback loops coming back to inform the design of the system. But yeah, it's going to take a lot of tweaking and changing, I would say.
All right, any other question in the group? No. So I have two questions for you. One is you were talking about the GFRAS national platform, and I think that has quite a lot of relevance for us in the way we do multi-stakeholder dialogue. So can you just quickly, briefly elaborate about in which country they operate and what's their role and what are they doing exactly and who's part of those platforms?
Yes, so the Global Forum for Rural Advisory Services is an international platform that actually the Secretariat is based in Switzerland. They have regional networks. So for Africa, there's the African Forum. And then within Africa, they have a West and Central Africa sub-network. They have a Southern Africa sub-network, etc. In Africa, they're in 24 countries formally with an established country platform. This is meant to be a space, a platform for everybody in extension, from farmer providers to public sector, education people, anyone interested in extension, to come together to prioritize problems, to strengthen capacity, to define research priorities, and also to advocate or to lobby for extension services. So I can show, there's some examples like Malawi and Uganda have quite active forums. They're like convening meetings to talk about extension. They're taking documents to the government to say, you need to invest more in extension and this kind of thing. So Africa is a bit ahead. There's going to be a new platform in Indonesia. It's just starting. Liberia has a platform. There's a few in Latin America. Yes, there's a platform in Liberia. I can put you in touch with Edward Perry and some of the others who are leading it. Paraguay, yes, there's one there as well. So let me send maybe to Nicola the contacts of these people and some web links where you can find further information.
Excellent. Yeah, that will be very useful because as we have those technical working group on farm support systems, it will make complete sense to bring the people within those platforms on extension in those discussions in the country that we have in common. Yeah, so we're interested in, as Pascal mentioned, Liberia, Paraguay, Brazil, and Indonesia specifically. My second and last question, and I think after we have to move on in the spirit of time, is so I personally very much like when I was doing the literature review on the toolkit, the best fit framework, because extension is a very complex topic. It's highly technical, and the best fit framework really provided me an understanding of, all the different elements together about what do we need to look at when we look at extension. The question is there any other analytical framework for looking at extension? What else there is than the best fit framework to apply in practice?
Okay, yeah, good question. Actually, I've just been working on an edited book that brings together the best fit framework. It brings together, there's a GFROS guide to evaluate extension services. I can send you the link to that as well. But it's mostly based on the OECD evaluation criteria, things like effectiveness, efficiency, relevance, sustainability, and impact. And then some people try to use the agricultural innovation system, but I wouldn't say it's gone far enough developed to be an analytical tool per se. I know some colleagues from CIRAD are trying to develop a method of analyzing innovation systems in their entirety, which is quite huge. So I can put you in touch with those people as well. They held a meeting just a few months ago in Paris to discuss that. They're working together with FAO on innovation system diagnosis. So some people try to use the agricultural innovation systems approach, which is much broader, and it's focused on the policies and the interactions more than the actors themselves. So there's those three. I can send you some more details on those.
Excellent. So we can send that to the group afterwards.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much for your insights on the best fit framework. I think it's super useful for us, especially as you're going to see now, the toolkit that we are working on is very much based on that best fit framework. So can you see the slides?
Nicolas?
Yeah. Yeah.
Pascal Bonson raised her hand.
Sorry,
Oh,
just
sorry.
one last question really quickly to Christine. I'm just curious to see if you've seen good practices, good incentives in particular for crowding in the private sector in that space. And when I'm saying the private sector, I'm not necessarily only looking at, value chain actors, such as, off-takers, processors, whatever you may want to call them, but also small entrepreneurs, that want to offer extension services as a business for themselves. So I'm just curious if you have anything on that, anything you can share also, electronically after this call. Thanks.
Yeah, there's been a few initiatives in two of the countries we studied, Guinea and Nigeria, actually, to develop agripreneurs and to take a set of young people, give them some training and maybe even some on-the-job experience, but then in the hopes that they're going to go off and become, their own self-employed person after that, based on the training and so forth. So we do see some examples of that. And otherwise, to attract the private sector in general, I think you need special policies and so forth, and that really depends on the attitudes of the government and whether they offer them special tax breaks or anything like that. We saw some of that in Ethiopia, even though it wasn't one of our studies. But there are a few examples I can share with you in terms of trying to especially deal with the youth bulge in Africa and other areas of the world as well as provide rural employment.
Great, thank you. Anything on challenge funds? Have you seen these as working as incentives?
We haven't specifically looked at any of the challenge funds in the countries that we looked at, so I can't really comment on that.
All right, thank you.
Thanks.
Nicola, one last building on what Pascalie just said. I think, Christine, the community as a whole, we will be a taker of
Microphone.
Thanks, Matthias. We will be taker of your experience in the type of incentive that have proven successful to bring business to fund public-private partnership around extension services, right? We would be very interested in this. If you know some example, please share them with us.
Okay.
Any last minute question? Pascal? Excellent. Yeah, so I'm going to go into more details now for the second part of the workshop on the toolkit that we are trying to develop within UNDP. You know, we've realized that in many countries where we operate on commodities, farmer support systems, and extension and advisory systems are an integral part of what we do, but often we don't know exactly how to approach it, or we don't do it in a systemic way. So that's how the idea of the toolkit came, so that we can support the practitioners from UNDP and partners in the project we operate to have a more, exactly like the best fit framework, a more analytical framework on how to deal with extension systems. So our focus is obviously on sustainable commodity production, and often it's very much associated with national extensions, agriculture system, of course. So I presented previously the toolkit in short, but basically just a reminder, the objective is really to develop for, as I mentioned, a targeted audience of practitioners. What we want to do is a simple, easy to use and action-oriented toolkit, because in a way it's so complex what we are looking at, how we can translate that in a simple way without losing too much of the complexity. And that's, I think, the really difficult exercise here. But the idea is to basically facilitate access to information and know-how on extension key elements, as you presented in the best fit framework, but it's also to stimulate debate in a structured way within the multi-stakeholder dialogue that we have, obviously in order to support the elaboration of innovative policy recommendations on extension, etc. But it's also to, as I mentioned previously, to jointly diagnose problem, explore opportunities together, solutions together, and as well is also important for us to have a comprehensive analytical frameworks for designing projects also, because a lot of UNDP projects, JEF projects, RED Plus projects have actually a component on extension, and often the team are not extension specialists. So this toolkit is really to support them in that sense. So there's 5 elements to the toolkit. There's the analytical framework and the joint diagnosis decision tool, guidance, best practices library, and a training program. So today the focus of the discussion will be really on the joint diagnosis and decision tool that we are in the process of developing. So just a reminder, the analytical framework is largely building on what Christine just presented, because we think it's good and it's comprehensive. It's adapting it a bit to our needs and objectives to reflect better the audience that we have. But it's basically 5 elements, very similar: policy, environment, governance structures, management capacity, methods, financing, and M&E and learning. So that's how we're going to look at extension. And going to the next slide. So yeah, the remaining of the discussion is really on this diagnosis and decision tool. So last time I explained that, often an assessment to strengthen an extension system is done often by a consultant, a team of consultants, and then they're going to have a workshop to present the results of the report, the study, and then there's going to be recommendations made, etc. So here the idea is that you are assessing jointly together with all the practitioners what is the current status of an extension system. So obviously that's going to be an exercise that is going to be a bit more qualitative rather than more in-depth study that is also part of the process, and I'm going to explain that in a bit. But the idea of the tool we're developing is really for using it in multi-stakeholder dialogue, and the national commodity platform that we have provide that opportunity. So the idea is that it's a bit repetitive here, but it's a qualitative exercise, multi-stakeholder group. What we've done is basically translate this analytical framework, very much similar to the best fit framework, into 75 questions, basically. That's the idea. And those questions are telling you what are the key elements to consider when you look at extension. And then you're going to identify together the key strengths and weaknesses that are affecting the performance of your extension system. It's also a scorecard. So the idea is to fit also in our own M&E systems, and Pascal, that will interest you. So the idea will be to record the baseline situation in year 0 when we do that exercise. And then on a yearly basis, we can track progress by seeing how the scorecards is evolving based on the recommendations that have been made, the policy change, how the project is impacting the extension services, etc. So we need to be able to monitor the change we are creating through that process. So that's why the idea came to do actually a scorecard with those questions. So as I mentioned, it can be conducted within the context of national commodity platform, like in Indonesia, in Liberia, in Paraguay. But I think that if there isn't that process, but there is an interest from the government in the countries we operate to start that process of strengthening extension system, we can set up a similar methodology of multi-stakeholder dialogue that we have, but really targeted at extension. So who's going to be part of that exercise is basically in the existing national community platform, we have, as Christine mentioned, technical working group on farmer support systems. And so, you could have head of extension, field practitioners, ITC support staff, private sector, engines. So all the different service providers obviously needs to be part of that joint assessment together with the growers, producer organization representative, etc., etc. So that's why I asked you that question, Christine, about the GFRAS national platform, because obviously if you have already one in Liberia that is encompassing all the service providers, etc., that will make complete sense that we connect the technical working group that we have with the national platform from GFRAS. So this diagnosis tool is in 3 parts. One is general information on the service providers. Then there's the joint assessment in itself. And then there's the scoring and measuring progress. So I'm going to show you actually the document. It's going to be easier. So that's, can you see the document? Yes? So that's where we are. I mean, this is being developed at the moment, and for you to see exactly at what stage we are. So the general information on service providers, as you know, it can be the government, it can be the private sector, it can be an NGO. There's often a pluralistic system, as Christine mentioned. So it's just to gather basic information about the contact person, the legal status, the sources of funding, which are very important for us to understand as we want to develop a budgeted national action plan on those things. What type of human resources, what are the financial expenditures, etc. So that's kind of a simplified version from, I think, IFPRI and FAO have those type of survey that they're conducting in different countries. It's just to provide you some basic information on the service provider. So the list of questions I'm going to show you are not yet finalized. They need to be reviewed and completed by the end of the year. As part of that, you are part of the consultation as well. And what I need to do in the question I'm going to show you is to make sure that we have a clear focus on sustainable production. That's really fundamental for us. on gender. I think a lot of people that we've talked to, and also within our own priorities within UNDP, we've decided that whatever we do on extension needs to have a clear gender focus. We're also interested to look at the deforestation frontier because we work in a lot of places with trying to avoid deforestation, like in Indonesia, in Liberia, in Ivory Coast, in Ghana. And the expertise on extension related to that is very limited usually. So what can we do to strengthen that? That's something that we are interested in. One thing I'm struggling by defining those questions, so to be fully transparent, is how do you adequately capture differences between countries in the way questions are formulated? So are we having only one tool, or do we need to adapt that tool to countries? I'm thinking that it's possible to have some general questions that are largely applicable to many countries, but maybe we will need to see how the local perspective is integrated. And also, one thing that I found interesting is how to ensure that the questions are not ideological, because a lot of aspects in extension are ideological. You know, should the private sector, should you privatize extension systems, you know, like after the structural adjustment? Should you decentralize, you know, and there's completely different views about what needs to be done. You know, people saying it needs to be the private sector, it needs to be the public sector, it needs to be decentralized, it shouldn't be. So I don't want the questions to be ideological. So how do we make sure of that? So that's just for information. So I'm going to show you, so there's 75 questions, but I'm going to show you, so there's a question. Okay, Pascal's switching up. So I'm just going to show you the 21st questions so you have an understanding of the concept. I'm not going to show you the 75 questions, but I think it's important that you understand the concept so you can see how applicable it is or not to your country. And again, this is completely in development. There's ample space to change the concept, and you know, your input is very much valued here because this is not the final document at all. So if you take the analytical framework that you've seen, and we take, for example, the first one, which is the policy, environment, and the governance structures that, for example, Christine presented in the context of Rwanda and Liberia. So the idea of this qualitative exercise is you bring all the people in the room, and then they're going to decide jointly what's the status. Okay. So, for example, do you have a policy and a vision for national extension services? No. It's under development, yes, but it needs to be improved. Yes, it's satisfactory. And you can see a scoring system linked to each question that leads to the scorecard. And actually a question for you, Christine, is at a later stage is, do you know any existing scorecard on assessing extension systems? We don't reinvent the wheel. And the idea of the toolkit here is that you also can capture the different views on the answer, because obviously different service provider will have different views. So for example, the second question, what's the level of buy-in of stakeholders into the vision, into the policy? Is it low, medium, high? So I gave the example last time that, for example, the Ministry of Agriculture will say, well, it's very high, you know, everybody like it because they developed that policy, but then the private sector sitting in the room will say, well, actually we disagree with many elements of your policy. So we think actually the level of buy-in is very low. So the idea of the tool is that you can capture some of those misaligned views and interests, which I think is very important for us to capture. And that's what we're trying to capture also in the national commodity platform. The third element is, do you have inclusion of SDG objectives beyond productivity into the policy and vision? No, partial, satisfactory. The extension services approach is largely demand farmer driven, focusing on the needs of small scale men and women farmers. No, partially, yes. So, you know, those responses, we can change them easily. You know, it should be more disaggregated, etc. I think there's a lot of space for refinement, but I think you get the concept. Existence of long-term political commitments. Are you able to budget in the next 5 years, or actually it's a very short-term vision. So this is for the vision, one element of the framework, and the question is, are there the most important questions when you talk about vision? Is there any others? Are they not ideological? All those things. That's what we are trying to see. So I'm going to give you another example on the diversity of service providers. Government policy encourage non-public institutions, NGOs, private sector, and farmer organizations to become involved in the delivery of extension services. No, somehow, yes. The specific roles and functions played by each service provider is largely based on their respective comparative advantage. What's the strength of the financial and organizational sustainability of the service provider? Existence of incentives to stimulate involvement of non-public institutions. No underdevelopment needs improvement, or there are strong incentives. This is a problem we see in many countries. We're talking to the private sector and they're saying there's no incentives for them to engage in the extension systems, or there is, etc., etc. So I think you got the concept. I don't need to go into too much details there. We've done the same for each element of the analytical framework. So partnerships, the management capacity, on gender, for example, the percentage of female extension workers allows to adequately reach rural women, the focus for deliveries on producer group rather than individual farmers, so you can achieve more efficiency, and so on, and so on, and so on. So this is quite complex to define those questions because there's so many elements you could consider. But yeah, we're trying, that's what I mean by trying to make it simple, because 75 questions sitting in a room, we can do it in a 2 days meeting, having a very nice discussion around those things. And when there is complete disagreement, you could use methodology like the scales of agreement, for example, where you can ensure that you find some similarities in what people think. So that's the first, the second element, that's the joint assessment. And then going down, the last part is the scoring. So don't look really at the score, but if you take those 75 questions, you're gonna have a maximum score that you can achieve. And I put three level of performance. I mean, this is gonna be contested and political, and maybe we're gonna do it differently, but the idea is that through that qualitative exercise, and I repeat, it's a qualitative exercise that needs to be completed by other studies, you can see if your country is at a lower level of performance, mid-level, or more on the higher level of performance. And there we need, expertise like Christine and other experts to tell us, this makes sense or it doesn't make sense. So, once you've done that, the first year you say my score is whatever, and then you put some comments, and then you can assess progress on a yearly basis. You have a project and you have a national commodity platform in Liberia. They do that process in 2019, and then in 2020 they come back and they say, well, thanks to all the work that we've done, a score has improved of 25 points. And so that's the key progress we've made, and that's the priorities for next year. So it's a way to capture in a simple form, the status of where you are. And the difference between what we're doing today is that today we don't have a systemic way to do that exercise, and we don't have a list of questions. So, we're sitting in a technical working group saying we're going to improve extension, but, we might talk for 5 days about advisory methods and forget all the rest. So the advantage of that analytical framework is that you need to look at in a comprehensive way, basically. And so, you can sign that document by the chair of the group or the head of the service provider or whatever. We can see the best way to do that. Another way we can capture change, with Pascal, we've developed this ladder of change specifically in the context of national commodity platform. And we could adapt that ladder of change to the specificities of extension. And here we're looking at change of behavior and mindset, you know, like attitudes to dialogue. You know, there's no dialogue taking place between private sector and public sector on extension. They completely disagree. Or there's a dialogue that is emerging between stakeholders. Actually, dialogue is not taking place, and now it's active listening, mindful speaking, and then it's trust and compassion. So, you know, we could also capture that on extension because it's a way to see the things that you don't see, you know. And I can tell you in P&G at the moment where we're working, we talk to the private sector, they're saying the public sector extension systems are not working, inefficient, and then vice versa. So there's no real dialogue, you know. So you can see the color coding here in year 0, you know, there's no dialogue. And then after 1 year, well, actually, there is dialogue taking place. So, you know, in a 5-year time frame, you can really capture change in an innovative way. So that's a bit the idea of the diagnosis tool. I'm going to stop here 1 second to see if there's any questions of comprehension. Do you understand the concept? Is it all clear? Or you have any questions of clarification at this stage? No? Pascal? Yeah, I can see you raising your hand. Go ahead.
Yes, thanks. I mean, very interesting. I'm trying to get a sense from you about the optimal participation in that 2-day workshop that will lead to answer in a dynamic way the 75 question. I assume, Nicolas, that there is as much value in the process and the conversation in answering the question that in the score in itself. So I guess it also depends who is around the table. So do we have an optimal participation, and how this participation need to be continuous so that the score can be compared from 1 year to the other? Do we need continuous participation? Do we need the same people? Blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, so initially this tool has been developed really in the context of national commodity platform. So in countries where we do have national commodity platform, as you know, it's a process that lasts a minimum of 5 years. And you have those technical working groups that are working on, you know, usually on a period of a minimum of 1 to 2 years, and to develop this national action plan. So that will be the participation. So it's not like you're going to have only a 2 days meeting with people who don't know each other from before, etc. It's part of a larger process, and that element is part of a larger process. That's one thing. The second thing is in platforms, we also have this monitoring committee in countries that are better advanced, like Costa Rica, and what's being soon implemented in Indonesia, for example. So that could be, for example, the role of the monitoring committee to convene a meeting, you know, once the national action plan is already approved, etc. They can convene a meeting with the people that participated in the technical working group and to review after 3 years where we stand or something. In the countries where we don't have national commodity platform, we will have to identify the best way to do that. So this is actually one element of it, but yeah, someone has a question? The second part to it is, you know, if you do a qualitative exercise like that, that doesn't lead to anything, that's not very useful. Okay, you have a scorecard, but how do you translate that exercise into something action-oriented? And I think so you shouldn't see the tool that I just presented in isolation from the entire toolkit. I had this word tool and toolkit, but anyway, that's what we're using. So, you know, the next step is the decision tool, which is exactly with the same group of people, Pascal, you know, so they don't only sit, you know, for 2 days to do that qualitative exercise. Then the idea is that they need to work together on defining what they're going to do to improve the system. So So here, the idea of that decision tool, and the name can be changed, you know, diagnosis decision tool. I don't think it's very exciting at the moment, so we can definitely change those names to make them more attractive. But that's just for you to understand what's the meaning of what we're trying to achieve. So here is, once you've done that exercise, you need to define collective action and collective investment, which is the most difficult to do. So it's a semi-structured group discussion. And the idea is that we will provide the questions to the group to facilitate that discussion. And you can then, in that tool, discuss, you know, for example, optimal numbers of staff that you need in the country, budget levels, budget allocations. You can assess gaps, discuss targets together. So often also this is done in a consultancy study, in-depth study. So this is an opportunity to discuss those targets together. And so the idea of the tool is really to contribute to the larger national action planning process in the countries where we have national commodity platform. As I said, it's the same group as the diagnosis tool. Here you might need more time because you discuss finance and complex issues. I don't know many days, but you know, you can think about how many one-day meeting we need to reach something concrete. So for example, for National Action Plan in Indonesia, it took them almost 3 years to define what are those collective action and investment. So, and something very important is what we are proposing here, as I mentioned, and I'm repeating it, it needs to be complemented by an in-depth study before the process starts to assess, you know, the current status of extension. So, you know, at the moment, what we do is this root cause analysis, where we, for the National Action Plan, sorry, I'm using a lot of jargon for Christine, who's not familiar with those national commodity platform. So the idea will be to have the same concept of doing a root cause analysis of the key strengths and weaknesses of extension systems. If it's done already, like in Liberia, by another partner organization, you don't need to do a new one. But if you're in a country where it doesn't exist, you need that as a document to be able to frame the discussion for deciding collective action and investment. So what you're trying to achieve here is that will be the outcome, if you want, which is very similar to the template for a national action plan. Is, you know, what are the activities that we're going to do on sustainable commodity production, not a national extension system. Who's the lead institution? Who are the support, verification, time frame, budgets, and financial sources? So if I take the simple example of there's no policy. So, you know, your first activity, we're going to develop a national extension policy or strategy for sustainable palm oil in Papua New Guinea, for example. The Ministry of Agriculture is going to lead, is going to be partnering with the private sector, civil society, etc. Your baseline is you don't have a policy, your target is, etc., etc. It's going to cost $50,000 and it's going to be financed from the national budget. And here what is very important in the tool is you need to work on a budget. It has to be costed and you need to explain what's going to be the financial sources. Is it going to be private, public, donor, or are you going to look for funds? But it needs to be, so as you can see, it's a quite complex exercise, but that's the exercise we're doing anyway as part of the national action planning process. So it's just framing it for extension in a, again, in a systemic way. So let me just show, can you see my screen still? So, sorry, we're a bit late on the timing. So basically, you're going to have the same table for each element of the framework. You know, policy environments, what are the activities we're going to do? We're going to form and strengthen smallholder association, for example. Management capacity, we're going to set up a center of excellence for sustainable palm oil. So this is taken actually from a real national action plan in Indonesia. They put that in the national action plan. So, and then you're going to have, you know, questions for semi-structured group discussions that I haven't defined yet, but, you know, to lead the discussion about how we're going to what do we need to do, basically. And at the end, you can also have, sorry, I'm going fast, a general budget. So on extension in general, to improve sustainable palm oil in Indonesia, we're going to have 25 activities, and it's going to cost us $5 million, and this is going to be the sources of funding. So that's what I mean by action-oriented. It's really going from a qualitative exercise, bringing in-depth study, and then having a real national action plan that can be monitored at country level. So it's quite ambitious, but this is the ambition that UNDP has put itself for sustainable commodity production. So that's what we are trying to do. So back to the presentation. So how this is relevant to the work we're doing. So we have in the call, who's in the call? We have Liberia, we have Gala and Ronalds. Do we still have Indonesia, Pisha? Yes. PNG is not there, but they're going to listen to the recording. So I just wanted to show you quickly how these are direct relevance to the work you're doing. I think you got the point already, but I just want to insist. So in Indonesia, for example, the national action planning process is complete, okay? It's been done already, you have an approved document, and that toolkit on extension didn't exist. But you have a very strong component on increasing smallholder capacity, and you have many elements actually of this analytical framework that we presented. So, developing a strategy, developing center of excellence, improving the advisory methods, et cetera, et cetera. So a potential use of the toolkit at national level is you can use the diagnosis tool by the monitoring committee, as I mentioned, to monitor implementation, NAP implementation. So now you're starting the National Action Plan implementation on smallholder capacity. On a yearly basis, you can see the progress made, but you can also identify what's missing in your National Action Plan that you didn't consider 2 years ago because you didn't have that analytical framework, for example. And so that's one way to use it. Another way to use it is at the moment in Indonesia, you need to develop, to work on the financing of the National Action Plan because that was not done in parallel. So you can also use the decision tool to support the financing of the National Action Plan related to extension services. So this is just example of the current National Action Plan in Indonesia. Sorry, we're way ahead of time. Do you want me to go faster or this is relevant?
Pascal Lee wants to talk.
Yeah, I just want to add another element which is valid for Indonesia, Liberia, and Paraguay is that in GGP, we're bringing in another element which is not there. And I'm just wondering, I'm thinking out loud here, but once your input and Pisha is here and Liberia is here, so that would be useful. As you know, the approach we are taking in GGP is we are trying to develop a farmer support system strategy. And as part of it, we are doing a farmers trainings needs assessment in each of those countries. And in some of those countries, not Liberia, but in Indonesia and Paraguay, we are testing techniques. So it will go into extension services methods. We're testing what works, what doesn't work in different landscapes. And these plus the training needs assessment become inputs for a farmer support system strategy. So obviously we also have the National Action Plan. So the idea is how do we make sure that the training needs assessment in a way also comes in as an input to your toolkit, because I think it's valuable as well as an input. So, and how-
definitely, and I'm presenting that just after actually.
Okay, great. Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay. So yeah, this we don't need to go through. That's the actual national action plan in Indonesia. So yeah, the question from Pascal is, the next slide actually is at the provincial level. You know, in Indonesia, we're working in West Kalimantan, North Sumatra, and Riau. And one thing I didn't mention is I think the potential to adapt the tool, the decision and diagnosis tool from a national, looking at national level on sustainable commodity production to provincial level, you know, there's a way to adapt that. And that's related to the question also of Pascal, how do we work at landscape or jurisdictional approach and all those things. I think that tool can be also adapted to that particular context. So in Indonesia, we have those farmer needs assessments. We need to improve farm support systems. We need to have provincial action plan. We need to pilot the implementation of the approach, and we need to develop those national smallholder support strategies. So that's in the existing project document. That's what we need, we do on extension. So again, the use of the toolkit here is, for example, Pascal, is that the analytical framework in the toolkit can support the TOR for farmer needs assessment. For example, so you ensure that all the key elements are considered in your TOR. So I know that, for example, in Liberia, those TOR have already been developed, but in other countries, it's not yet developed. So, you know, you can use the toolkit to develop TOR. You have a question, Pascal?
Yeah, it's done actually. The training needs assessments have been done in Indonesia already.
Okay, so it's just to mention that for other countries where we operate, you know, this can be done. So
I have a question. I think the presentation is fascinating, but I have an urgent question. And let me frame the question. This is a tool. And what we have realized over the last few years at GCP is that we need to work with greater consideration for the political economy and what's happening in the political context, and all those things that are slightly underground and not so visible. Christine, in the presentation, you alluded to this slightly about the broader political context of the base fit model. For me, I would like to ask you, Nicolas, if among the 75 questions, and in the decision-making tool, we are also looking into this, asking the difficult question, exploring into the sensitive issues, and not letting them unattended, assuming that everything that is technically coherent is going to be approved or validated. So I just want to see whether we are developing more fit for reality tool than technical tools here.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's the intention, you know, and the idea is that it's related to the GCP theory of change. So where we look at questions such as political economy, systemic change, corruption, and things like that. And that's, you know, part of the policy environment and contextual factors. I think what the best fit framework does is telling you in that policy environment and contextual factors, you have elements where you have an influence upon and some elements where you don't have any influence upon, you know? So the questions will be to identify where we could have an influence so that it can become a question, if you see what I mean. But the intention is definitely to bring in those difficult questions in the framework, yes.
I think areas where we do not have an influence are not necessarily areas that we should ignore, as you said it yourself, Nicolas, but areas where other processes, other forces at play may have an influence. So I think it is important to, in the new generation of tools that we are creating for the future of the GCP and our work, we need to make sure we attend to this and ask the question among the 75 questions. What is going to derail this well-oiled, natural, and completely logical process? Well, let's have the question. Let's identify these issues. And so I think it's good if we can do that now.
No, definitely. And I will definitely, need your expertise and expertise of GCP colleagues in all of these areas. You know, like when we bring in the political economy, you know, who can help building the toolkit, and when we bring in other aspects, etc. So yeah, I think point well taken. And this is, if it is a gap we've identified at national level, it needs to come in into those technical tools. I agree. All right, so to continue the discussion on Indonesia, I mean, obviously, Pascali, you know, the toolkit is in development, so there's a number of elements that you've already developed as part of your project implementation, etc. So, you know, if you already done the TOR for the farmer needs assessment, what you're gonna have, the process will be the farmer needs assessment at provincial level will be a kind of in-depth study that I mentioned, you know, that has looking at what farmer needs for sustainable palm oil, and that's going to inform the discussion, and you can have the meetings of the technical working group in that provincial platform to do both the diagnosis tool and the decision tool. So they're going to have the farmer needs assessment, they're going to sit and they're going to say, this is the current status of the extension system in West Kalimantan, and this is where we want to be, and this is the activities we're going to do based on that needs assessment. And to define your national smallholder support strategy, then the analytical framework is also directly useful. But we can work together in making it most applicable to your own needs, you know. So another example, in Papua New Guinea, we're launching the palm oil platform in Q4, and we're going to set up a technical working group on farmer support systems. So again, the toolkit will ensure that all the elements of the analytical framework can be considered in the root cause analysis report that we are doing. And it's going to help better structure the discussion within the technical working group, what needs to be done, and monitoring progress. So basically, you know, the use is a bit the same in all countries. Liberia, I mentioned a bit the same. So you've already done your TOR. I don't know if the needs assessment study is finalized. I haven't seen the report. But again, you can have the technical working group meeting. Actually, in the context of Liberia, you don't have yet technical working groups. You just have a oil palm platform, but those technical working groups are not set up. So the toolkit can help you set up the relevant technical working group, linking with the discussion we had on the GFRAS national platform. If you have already a GFRAS national platform, that's going to help you identify who should be sitting in that group. You can define your national action plan part for extension with that decision tool, and you can monitor the progress made. So that's a bit where we are. As you can see, it's quite action-oriented, and I don't think we have time to go for a breakout session, so let's just take questions now. I see a lot of Pascal is very active on chat. We can take some questions. The question I had for you was, you know, what additional questions you would like to consider in that diagnosis tool to assess the performance of national extension and advisory systems. For example, Pascal mentioned the political economy and those important contextual factors that we want to consider. What were your recommendations for the development of the decision tool? And if you have any general recommendations in general. So maybe we have a 10-minute discussion now. Feel free to write on the chat. I hope it was quite clear. And as I mentioned, this is really in development. So your input is very much needed here, specifically the countries that are with direct relevance like Liberia, Indonesia. I really want to discuss in detail with you guys so that we can make sure that this tool is the most relevant for you. So any questions or any potential answers to those questions for discussion? Or any questions of clarification? Sorry, a bit technical, this discussion.
I have a thought. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
And I just want to share it. I understood, Nicolas, that you said that typically a technical group will be set up to work on the assessment tool, and then will continue its work to support the decision-making process, right? I understand.
Yeah.
That's what you said. I'm really wondering whether there is not here a wrong assumption made that the people who are working technically on these issues are the people who should be sitting in the decision-making group. I think we are looking at different dynamics and different factors. And when you ask, what are your recommendations for the development of the decision tool? Well, I think my recommendation here would be, who are the most influencing parties in the decision-making process, as opposed to the policy recommendation process. You see what I mean?
Yes. Yeah, no, definitely. And actually the idea I had was that you're completely right, that the diagnosis is really technical, but then you need to complement the decision with decision makers. And the problem is, how do you maintain the right balance between, the level of seniority? That's a thing we struggle in each country we operate. Who should attend which meeting? This is a fundamental question. And if you're going to discuss about budget and priorities and sources of funding, you need not only decision maker, but you need also the government in charge of the budget to be sitting at the table. And yes, point well taken. You need to have an evolution in the group and a different representation based on the tool you're using. So fully agree with you. Yeah, very good points. I'm writing down. Any other recommendations, comments?
Hello, Nicola. Can I ask a question?
Hi, Gala. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Okay, and I was hearing about an extension group in Liberia, and I heard Mr. Edward Perry was a focal person of that group. And I just wanted to know in what manner our work at the platform is linked to this other group. If we have to know what they are doing. But I know at the ministry, and Mr. Perry is the director of Extension. We normally meet, but we have never met in a kind of meeting. One time he came to the platform meeting, that was all, but we are not seeing each other in a kind of forum. But with these two, you are presented, in what manner can the Oil Palm Technical Working Group or our plenary meeting and connect with this essential group that is already existing in the ministry?
Yeah, you're talking about this GFRAS national platform in Liberia, yeah? That's what you're talking about. So at the moment, you just have a plenary meeting in the platform because you are in the process of setting up the platform in Liberia for sustainable palm oil. And as you need to define the national action plan, you will be responsible to set up a number of technical working groups on the priorities of that you need to consider for the country. So one key objective of the platform is to develop a sustainable palm oil policy and action plan. And within that policy and action plan, you will identify a number of priorities, and that's going to be the topic for you technical working group. So you're going to have one on extension, one on legislation and enforcement mechanisms, and one on certification, or I don't know what's the priority in the country. So what we're saying is that once you're going to set up that technical working group on extension, on farm support systems, it needs to be connected to the existing group that Christine was mentioning, that is bringing all the different service providers. So I suppose the private sector is sitting there, the government is sitting there, et cetera, et cetera. So we can, bring the people in that platform, depending on activities, connect, and then link to the questions from Pascal is, making sure the decision makers are also there if they are not in that platform, etc. So we can work on this together to make it happen. But what's clear in Liberia is you need to set up technical working group in the next 6 months. Any other recommendations from the non-technical people? Matias, Aline, Emilio. Okay, Christine needs to go, and I think we need to close soon. Thank you so much, Christine, for your participation.
Thank you, Christine.
Thanks to all of you. We'll follow up by email, I suppose.
Yeah, we'll share a number of resources. Excellent. Thank you so much. Any other recommendations, anyone?
My second question, Nicholas.
Yeah.
And given the extensive of this and the issue of agriculture, you don't think, and
I cannot hear you.
And maybe in the future it will be good. Are you hearing me now?
Yeah, I hear you.
Yeah, I'm saying, and looking at the way the Ministry of Agriculture is important for this and the process it took it. You don't think that in the future, maybe some key person on the platform for the Ministry of Agriculture can participate in this workshop?
Which workshop you mentioned? You referring to?
I'm talking about what we are learning now.
So this is obviously going to be led by the Ministry of Agriculture because they are leading the platform in Liberia. So this entire process is going to be under the umbrella of the Ministry of Agriculture, I suppose.
Nicholas, are you getting me?
You're saying if the Ministry of Agriculture should be part of that process? That's what you're saying? That's your question?
I was asking, I'm saying this presentation you are presented to us in terms of learning for the first time for us. I was saying, and looking at the content of this presentation, maybe I was thinking whether to extend participation to the Ministry of Agriculture. Some key questions at the platform, for example, the focal person.
I cannot hear you very well. You said to share the presentation?
I think it's my internet. I don't know why.
Yeah, maybe you guys can. Gala, you can turn your video off. I'm gonna do it for you, and maybe you can write it on the chat box. I think that would be better.
Maybe you write it.
Okay.
Yeah. So just to clarify, also, I mean, maybe it's important for me to go to the next steps, and then we can see if there's any last questions, because this is not final. This is not a toolkit that we can already apply, share with partners. This is an internal discussion about we are developing at the moment. So we're still doing consultation. This is going to be presented to the entire GCP team in November in Panama in an annual meeting. And then we're going to finalize what I presented to you, the analytical framework, diagnosis, decision tool, in December based on the input from consultation. And then in 2019, I'm going to do a contribution to one country to discuss the potential of that toolkit with governments, private sector, and civil society. So kind of a fact-finding or truthing, I don't know what you call it in English, in Q1, you know, meeting with the head of extension, private sector. So maybe Papua New Guinea, but this is open for discussion. Then we're gonna launch the toolkit at the Good Growth Conference in May in Peru. And we also want to pilot that toolkit in 2 countries in 2019. And those countries need to be defined. So we need to discuss together as a team, do we want Liberia to try that toolkit, or Indonesia, or Papua New Guinea, etc., etc. And then, because we want the experience of those countries to inform the improvement of the toolkit for 2020. And then we're going to integrate that into all the platform guidance and processes and training, and do a training program. So as you can see, we're not yet at the stage of, you know, working with partner. However, the analytical framework is already there and available and can help you in your day-to-day work. So really the next step is finalizing that and deciding which countries are going to pilot that in 2019.
I have one last recommendation here.
Yeah.
Very generic, Nicola, and this is a recommendation based on what we've seen and about how toolkits are used. And I heard you don't like the term toolkit, and I think this is not a good term indeed, because you can have a good tool, but if you don't have the right craftsman, then you end up with a poor result. So yeah. We see this all the time with stakeholder analysis. A stakeholder analysis is a wonderful tool, but poorly used, it leads to a complete misleading result. And actually, it's a tick the box exercise that endorses and feeds into the wrong strategy that comes to haunt you much later down the track. So whether it's a root cause analysis, a stakeholder analysis, if it's done the wrong way, you end up with a disjointed and actually negative outcome. So I think in your toolkit recommendation, I think it's very important that you set the basis, the minimum requirement for operating the tool, below which the result cannot be validated. Meaning, without that type of participation, the results are negated. Without a qualified facilitation process that leave space for the more silent voice, the result cannot be validated. Without the representation from various groups, the result cannot be validated. And I think we need to do that, because we see a plethora of stakeholder analysis that are absolutely substandard, and we don't want any more of these tools. So you're developing a process where the quality of the debate is very important, and I think we need to have this part of your design package.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well taken. Thank you, Pascal. All right, I think it's getting late. Any last remaining questions? So if any one of you feel that you want to discuss that further, please do contact me at any time. Pascal, Gala, Ronald, the Indonesia team, the Papua New Guinea team, etc. I'm fully available to discuss that. As you can see, in terms of timelines, it might not fit perfectly with the project timeline, because that's a document in process. So we can do things in transition, and we can already improve the current situation by using already some of the elements of it. So please talk to me anytime. And I'm taking now 2 last questions, if any, before we close the workshop for today. Any last questions? No. Everybody's ready to go back to their emails. Excellent. Well, thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Nicola.
Thank you very much, Nicola. It was awesome.
We will send the recording to...
Nicola, I was like, my battery died. So I think I will want to follow up with you about the toolkit because we're like about to develop the farmer support strategy for Indonesia.
Yeah, okay. Do contact me anytime.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good rest of the day.
You too. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.